What if the CEO of a luxury restaurant walked in one night, only to witness a homeless veteran being thrown out like he didn't belong? But here's the twist. This wasn't just any CEO. And what happened next? No one saw it coming. Stay tuned, because this story will change the way you see justice, power, and second chances. The evening air in New York carried a crisp chill, the kind that made people quicken their steps and pull their coats tighter. The streets still hummed with life, yellow taxis glided past, distant sirens wailed, and the occasional burst of laughter echoed from late-night diners. Richard Cole walked alone along the sidewalk, his polished leather shoes tapping a steady rhythm against the concrete. He could have taken his car, had his driver pull up right to the entrance. But tonight, he wanted to see things differently. As CEO of Fair Taste, a well-established high-end restaurant chain, Richard believed in staying connected to the reality of his business. He had built his brand around exceptional service, a place where customers felt valued no matter who they were. At least, that was the image he had worked to maintain. A block away from the restaurant, Richard slowed his pace. He preferred unannounced visits, no managers scrambling to impress him, no carefully curated experience put on just for his approval. He wanted to see the place as it was on a regular night. As he approached the restaurant's glass doors, something caught his attention. A man, slouched in posture and dressed in layers of mismatched, tattered clothing, stood at the entrance. His graying beard was unkempt, his boots worn down to nearly nothing. The man wasn't loitering or begging, he was reaching into his pocket, fingers fumbling with a few crumpled bills. Carl Benson, the restaurant's longtime security guard, stood in front of him, arms crossed. His stance was firm, his expression unreadable but unmistakably dismissive. "I told you already, you can't come in," Carl said flatly. The older man took a step forward, gesturing toward the counter inside. "I have money. I just want to buy something to eat." Carl shook his head. "It's not about the money. We have a certain kind of clientele here. You don't belong." The words cut through the air like a cold wind. Richard felt a sharp twist in his chest. Inside, just beyond the glass, a cashier busied herself at the register, pretending not to notice. A few diners seated near the window glanced over but quickly turned back to their meals. No one spoke up, no one intervened. Richard stepped forward, voice calm but firm. "What's going on here?" Carl turned, startled for a moment before regaining composure. He clearly didn't recognize Richard, at least not right away. "Just making sure the place stays presentable," Carl answered. "This guy shouldn't be here." Richard ignored him and looked at the man. "Sir, what's your name?" The older man hesitated before answering. "James Miller." Richard studied him for a moment, something stirring in the back of his mind. The name felt familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. "You said you wanted to buy something to eat?" Richard asked. James nodded. "Just a meal, nothing else." Without another word, Richard pulled out his wallet, walked past Carl, and stepped up to the counter. The cashier straightened in surprise as he placed a crisp $20 bill on the counter. "One hot meal for Mr. Miller," Richard said. The woman behind the register hesitated but nodded, punching in the order. James looked between Richard and the cashier, his expression flickering between gratitude and disbelief. Carl stiffened. "Sir, I don't think you understand." Richard turned to face him. "I understand perfectly." His voice carried an authority that made Carl pause. "And I suggest you let Mr. Miller take his seat." A tense silence followed. Carl didn't argue further, but his displeasure was clear. James took a cautious step inside, his hands tightening around the edges of his worn-out coat. A server hesitated before gesturing him toward a table near the back. Slowly, James settled into the seat, eyes flicking around the restaurant, as if waiting for someone to change their mind and throw him out again. Richard stood nearby, watching the man closely. The dim restaurant lighting cast a soft glow on James's face, highlighting the deep lines and the exhaustion settled in his features. Then it hit him. That face, that name. He had seen James Miller before. Richard sat across from James, watching as the older man carefully lifted his spoon and took the first bite of warm soup. His hands, rough and weathered, trembled slightly as he held the utensil. He ate slowly, deliberately, as if savoring each bite. And Richard couldn't help but wonder how long it had been since he'd last had a proper meal. As James ate, something in Richard's mind clicked. He had seen this man before, not in passing. Not just another face among the city's countless homeless. But right here, in this very restaurant, years ago. Back then, James had been different. He had walked through these doors with confidence. Dressed neatly in a collared shirt and slacks. Always with a firm handshake and a warm smile. Richard remembered him chatting with the staff. Leaving generous tips. Treating the servers with the same respect he gave his colleagues. James had been a regular. Richard leaned forward, his voice gentle but laced with curiosity. You used to come here often, didn't you? James paused, his spoon hovering over the bowl. He looked up, meeting Richard's gaze for the first time. His expression shifted, recognition flickering in his tired eyes. I did, he admitted, a long time ago. Richard nodded, the memory becoming clearer now. You were always here with a group. Lunch meetings, right? A faint smile touched James's lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. Yeah, my team and I back when we had a place to be every day. He exhaled a slow, weary breath. Feels like another lifetime. Richard hesitated, then asked, what happened? James set his spoon down, his fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the table. I was in the military. Served for 15 years. Got out. Started working as an electrical technician for a company downtown. Nothing fancy, but it paid the bills. He sighed. Then the company folded, just like that, after 20-something years in business. They shut their doors. Layoffs. No severance for most of us. I thought I'd find something else fast. But, he trailed off, shaking his head. Richard didn't interrupt. James continued, his voice quieter now. Turns out, nobody wants to hire a 60-year-old vet, no matter how much experience he has. I tried everything. Interviews, applications, even odd jobs. But the rejections kept coming. Savings ran out, couldn't afford rent. One thing led to another, and suddenly, he motioned vaguely at himself. At his worn-out clothes. His rough appearance. This is what's left. Richard felt a deep, unsettling anger rise in his chest, not at James, but at the system that had let this happen. A man who had served his country, who had worked hard his entire life, discarded like he no longer had value. You're telling me no one would give you a chance? Richard asked, his voice sharper than he intended. James let out a dry chuckle. People don't say it outright. They just find polite ways to tell you that you're too old. Too much of a risk. Some don't even bother pretending. One guy looked me in the eye and said, we need someone who can keep up, not someone who'll slow us down. Richard clenched his jaw. James sighed again. I don't want pity, if that's what you're thinking. I don't even expect help. I came back here because I remembered this place. Remembered feeling like a person here. And I still had enough to buy one decent meal. He gestured toward the bowl in front of him. Didn't think that would be such a problem. Richard's chest tightened. He glanced toward the front of the restaurant, where Carl stood near the entrance, arms crossed, still watching James with open disapproval. Richard turned back to James. It shouldn't be a problem, he said firmly. James looked at him for a moment before nodding. Guess not everyone agrees. As James finished his meal, he moved to stand, ready to leave, but before he could take a step, Carl's voice rang out from the front of the restaurant. You got what you wanted, Carl said, loud enough for the room to hear. But let's be clear, this isn't a place for people like you. Don't make a habit of coming back. The words hit like a slap. A few customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The cashier looked down, pretending not to hear. No one spoke up. James didn't react at first. He simply exhaled, a long, tired breath, like someone who had heard the same thing too many times to still be surprised. Richard, however, felt something snap inside him. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor, and turned to Carl. You're out of line, Richard said, his voice measured but firm. Carl shrugged. I'm just enforcing the rules. Richard's next words cut through the room like a blade. I own this restaurant. The color drained from Carl's face. I'm Richard Cole, CEO of Fair Taste. Richard continued, his voice unwavering. And as of this moment, I'm making something very clear. This is not how we treat people. Silence hung heavy in the air. Carl opened his mouth, then closed it again, searching for words. I was just following. There's no policy that says we turn people away based on how they look. Richard interrupted. That's not our brand, and it's not who we are. He let the words settle before adding, unless you think otherwise. Carl swallowed hard, his bravado cracking under the weight of the moment. I didn't mean anything by it. I was just trying to keep things professional. Richard's gaze didn't waver. Then I suggest you readjust your definition of professional. He turned back to James. You don't have to leave if you don't want to. James studied him for a long moment before nodding. I think I'll go for now, he said quietly. But, thank you. Richard gave him a nod in return. This isn't over. As James stepped outside, disappearing into the night, Richard remained standing, his mind already turning. Tomorrow, he would get to the bottom of this. The morning light barely crept through the blinds of Richard's office as he sat at his desk. Already deep in thought, he had barely slept the night before, his mind replaying the incident at the restaurant over and over. The look in James's eyes, resignation, quiet acceptance of being turned away, bothered him more than he expected. This wasn't just about one bad employee. It was bigger than that, and he needed answers. By 9 a.m., the conference room at Fairtast's headquarters was filled with the upper management team. The atmosphere was tense. Most of them had never been called in for an unscheduled meeting like this. Richard stood at the head of the table, his hands resting on the polished wood surface, surveying the faces in front of him. I want to know exactly how our customers are being treated, he began. Specifically, I want to understand if what I saw last night was an isolated incident or something more widespread. A murmur spread through the room. Some managers exchanged uncertain glances, while others scribbled notes, waiting for clarification. Richard continued, his tone even but firm. We're pulling security footage from all locations over the past 3 months. I want to review how customers are being handled, especially those who might not fit the ideal image of our clientele. He let the words settle before adding, and I want honesty from all of you. If there's a problem, now's the time to bring it up. A silence followed. At first, no one spoke. Then, a voice at the far end of the table hesitantly broke through. Maria Lopez, the regional manager overseeing several Fair Taste locations, cleared her throat. Sir, this isn't the first time. Richard turned his attention to her. Go on. Maria shifted uncomfortably but held his gaze. I've had concerns for a while now. I've seen cases where security or even staff discourage certain people from dining in, not because they're causing trouble, but because they don't fit the brand. She exhaled, as if relieved to finally say it aloud. It's not an official policy, but it's an unspoken rule in some locations. The idea is to maintain a premium atmosphere for our higher-paying customers. Richard's stomach tightened. Who decided this? Maria hesitated before responding. It's coming from some store managers. People like Carl Benson take it upon themselves to interpret what's best for business. A few others in the room shifted uncomfortably. Some nodded subtly in agreement. Others avoided looking in Richard's direction altogether. Richard inhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay composed. So, we have people in our company turning away paying customers based on appearance? And no one thought to bring this to my attention? Another voice spoke up, this time from the director of operations. To be fair, Richard, these decisions aren't entirely without reason. We have to consider the experience of our core clientele. If we start allowing certain demographics in too freely, we risk damaging the brand we've built. Richard turned his head sharply. You mean we risk making Fair Taste an actual welcoming place for all paying customers? The director cleared his throat. That's not what I meant. But we can't ignore that some customers come here expecting a certain level of exclusivity. Richard's jaw clenched. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. This wasn't just a single bad employee with poor judgment. This was a mindset that had been allowed to fester under his watch. Let's be clear, Richard said, his voice sharp. If anyone thinks our brand is about exclusion, they're mistaken. That is not who we are. And if that means losing a few customers who expect us to police who belongs in our restaurants, so be it. He turned his attention back to Maria. How often does this happen? Maria hesitated. I don't have exact numbers, but it's more frequent than you'd think. And it's not just about turning people away. Some managers encourage waitstaff to subtly steer certain customers toward takeout instead of letting them dine in. Richard exhaled through his nose, frustration simmering beneath the surface. I want a full review of every location, he said, and I want a list of every manager who has enforced or supported this kind of behavior. A weight hung over the room. No one argued, no one defended the practice. Then the conference room door swung open, and Carl Benson stepped in. Someone must have called him in response to the meeting. His expression was unreadable as he walked toward the table. You wanted to see me? Carl asked, his voice even but with an edge of defiance. Richard gestured to an empty seat. Sit down. Carl didn't. I'd rather stand. Richard studied him for a moment before speaking. I need you to explain something to me. Why did you turn James Miller away last night? Carl barely blinked. Because I was doing my job. Your job is to provide security, not to decide who gets to eat. Carl's expression didn't waver. With all due respect, sir, it's my job to make sure our clientele feel comfortable. That means keeping an environment where people want to spend money. When you start letting in people who look like, he hesitated, choosing his words, people who don't fit, it changes the perception of the place. Richard felt his fingers curl into a fist beneath the table. You mean people like veterans? People who have worked hard their whole lives and fallen on tough times. That's the kind of person we should be excluding? Carl let out a breath. It's not personal. It's business. We're not a soup kitchen. The room fell silent. Richard straightened, his decision made. You're right about one thing. Carl, this is business. And as of now, you're no longer a part of it. Carl's face barely registered surprise. You're firing me. Yes. Richard's voice was steady. And we're also reviewing every store that's followed this kind of unspoken rule. Carl didn't argue. Instead, he gave a slow nod. Your funeral, he muttered, before turning and walking out of the room. The tension in the room lingered even after Carl was gone. Richard let the silence sit for a moment before looking around the table. This ends now, he said. I don't care how long it's been happening or who thought it was a good idea. Fair Taste is going to be a place where everyone is treated with dignity. No one spoke, but Richard could tell. This was only the beginning of the battle. Richard sat in his office, staring out the window at the city below. The meeting had gone exactly as he expected, uncomfortable, revealing, and necessary. But firing Carl was only the first step. If Fair Taste was going to change, it had to be more than just removing a problem. It had to be about creating solutions. His thoughts kept circling back to James. The man had once been a regular customer. Someone who had a stable life and a steady job. Now he was sleeping on the streets. Not because of any fault of his own, but because the system had failed him. Richard couldn't shake the feeling that simply buying him dinner wasn't enough. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. Brooklyn Veterans Outreach. A woman's voice answered. This is Richard Cole. I'm looking for a man named James Miller. I believe he's been here before. The woman hesitated. James was here a while back. But he's no longer in our program. He didn't meet the long-term requirements. Richard's grip on the phone tightened. Where can I find him? After a moment of silence, she sighed. Try the shelter on Lexington and 5th. He's been in and out of there. Richard thanked her, grabbed his coat, and headed out the door. The shelter was exactly what he expected, cramped, dimly lit, and filled with exhausted faces. The air smelled of overcooked vegetables and worn-out hope. A volunteer at the front desk pointed Richard toward the back, where a group of men sat around a battered table, nursing cups of coffee. James was among them, hunched over his cup, stirring absent-mindedly. Richard approached, pulling out the chair across from him. James. The older man looked up, surprised, then wary. Didn't think I'd see you again. Richard folded his hands on the table. I've been thinking about what you told me. About how hard it is to get work when people only see your age. Not your experience. James let out a dry chuckle. Yeah, well, thinking about it won't change much. Richard leaned forward. Maybe it will. James raised an eyebrow but said nothing. I want you to come work for me, Richard said. James blinked, taken aback. What? Not charity. Richard continued. I'm offering you a job. A real one. James shook his head, leaning back in his chair. Richard, I appreciate what you did last night, but I'm not some feel-good story for your company. I'm 63. I don't move as fast as I used to. And I've been out of work too long. I don't belong in a restaurant. Richard didn't waver. I'm not asking you to wait tables. I need someone I can trust. Someone who understands structure, discipline, and fairness. You were in the military, you know leadership. You know order. I need a quality control supervisor. Someone who can make sure my restaurants are living up to their standards. Can you do that? James hesitated. Richard pressed on. You told me that when you had a job, you felt like a person. I'm not offering you a handout. I'm offering you a chance to take back that feeling. James exhaled slowly, running a hand through his graying hair. You sure you want an old soldier in a place like yours? Richard nodded. I'm sure. James studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. All right, I'll give it a shot. That same afternoon, Richard returned to Fair Taste headquarters and called another meeting. This time, there was no discussion, no debate, just a firm declaration. Effective immediately, Carl Benson is no longer employed by this company, Richard announced. A few murmurs spread around the table, but no one spoke up against him. Let me be clear, he continued. This company does not tolerate discrimination. If you think otherwise, you're free to leave now. No one moved. Richard glanced at Maria, who gave a small nod of approval. Good, he said, because things are going to change. The following morning, James walked into Fair Taste headquarters for his first day on the job. Some employees stole curious glances. Others whispered. Not everyone was convinced he belonged. Richard watched from his office, arms crossed. This was just the beginning. James arrived at Fairtast's flagship restaurant early in the morning, dressed in his freshly pressed uniform. The navy blue button-down shirt and neatly embroidered name tag felt foreign to him, as if he were stepping into someone else's life. It had been years since he last held a formal job, and the thought of starting over, especially under the scrutiny of younger employees, made his stomach tighten. Richard was already waiting inside, standing near the entrance with a clipboard in hand. He greeted James with a firm handshake, his expression calm and reassuring. Glad you're here, Richard said. Let's get started. They walked through the restaurant together, Richard pointing out key areas, kitchen, service counters, dining sections, as they moved past a group of employees prepping for the breakfast rush. James noticed the way some of them glanced in his direction, exchanging looks he recognized all too well. Doubt, skepticism. James had seen that look before. In job interviews where he was politely dismissed. In waiting rooms where younger candidates were called in first. It didn't take words to know what they were thinking. A middle-aged man with a lean build and sharp features stepped forward. Arms crossed. Mark Reynolds, the branch's general manager. James, this is Mark, Richard said, motioning between them. He runs the day-to-day operations here. Mark forced a thin smile. Nice to meet you. James nodded. Likewise. The handshake that followed was brief, perfunctory. James could tell immediately. Mark wasn't pleased with his presence. They moved to the staff meeting area, where employees were already gathered for the morning briefing. Mark took his usual spot at the front of the room, but his expression remained stiff. With all due respect, Mark said, his voice carrying an edge, I don't understand why we're bringing in someone with no restaurant experience to oversee service operations. We have employees who've been here for years, who know this place inside and out. A murmur spread through the room. Some employees nodded in agreement, while others exchanged hesitant glances. Richard remained composed. James has experience in leadership, organization, and ensuring standards are met. That's exactly what we need. Mark pressed on. But this isn't the military. Running a restaurant isn't about barking orders, it's about understanding customers. Managing staff, handling logistics. I'm just saying there are people better suited for the role. James didn't flinch, but he felt the weight of the challenge in Mark's tone. He wasn't just questioning the decision, he was questioning James's ability to belong here. Richard exhaled slowly, then turned to address the room. Fair Taste isn't just about food, he said. We serve people, and that means treating everyone, employees and customers, with respect. If anyone has a problem with that, they're free to work somewhere else. A few employees shifted in their seats. Mark's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue further. The meeting concluded, and the team dispersed. James took his place at the front of the house, observing the morning rush. Despite the tense introduction, he remained focused. He took mental notes on how customers were greeted, how orders were handled, how employees interacted with guests. Some things ran smoothly, others, not so much. Then came the first test. A man in his late 50s walked in, his clothes worn but clean. He hesitated near the entrance, scanning the room. Before James could step forward, a young server named Derek intercepted the man. "Sir, I think takeout might be a better option for you," Derek said, his tone polite but firm. James narrowed his eyes. The customer looked confused. "I was hoping to sit down." Derek gave a rehearsed smile. "We're a little full today, but I can get your order to go in no time." James stepped in. "We have plenty of open seats," he said. "Right this way, sir." Derek hesitated. James didn't wait for an excuse. He motioned toward an empty table. The customer smiled gratefully and took a seat. Derek shot a quick glance toward Mark, who remained silent, arms folded. He wasn't stepping in to back James, but he wasn't stopping him either. James knew what was happening. Not everyone wanted change, and if he was going to prove he belonged, it would take more than a title. Richard sat in his office, staring at the reports scattered across his desk. He had suspected resistance after firing Carl, but what he hadn't expected was how deep the issue ran. The tension among employees at the flagship location was just the surface. There was something much larger at play. He needed proof, not just from one restaurant, but from every Fair Taste location under his name. He picked up his phone and made a call. By the end of the day, a discreet team of mystery shoppers had been deployed across multiple Fair Taste locations. These weren't just any undercover customers. They were instructed to observe how employees treated guests of different backgrounds. Some dressed in business attire. Others were sent in looking like they had fallen on hard times. Each of them took detailed notes, recording interactions, tone of voice, and even how long it took for them to be seated. The results came back within days, and they were worse than Richard had anticipated. 30% of the restaurants showed clear signs of discriminatory practices. Some customers were outright denied service under weak excuses, claims of being at capacity when plenty of tables sat empty. Others were subtly discouraged from dining in, with employees steering them toward takeout without being asked. A few locations even had unwritten policies about avoiding eye contact or minimizing interaction with customers who didn't fit the brand. And Mark Reynolds? His name appeared more than once. His restaurant wasn't the only one enforcing these practices, but it was one of the worst offenders. Richard didn't wait. He called for a company-wide management meeting. The conference room filled quickly, chatter buzzing among the regional managers and store leaders. Some sensed that something serious was happening. Others walked in with the usual confidence of those who assumed nothing could touch them. When Richard entered, the room fell silent. He placed the folder containing the mystery shopper reports on the table, letting the weight of the moment sink in before he spoke. "I asked a simple question last week," he began, his voice steady. "I wanted to know if what happened at one location was an isolated incident or a larger problem." He tapped the folder. "Now, I have my answer." He opened the report, flipping through pages. "In 30% of our stores, customers were treated differently based on their appearance. Some were denied service. Some were pressured to take their food to go. And in several locations, including this one, managers encouraged or enforced these behaviors." He paused, scanning the faces in front of him. "This is not just an isolated incident. This is a culture problem." A heavy silence followed. Then Mark, sitting near the front, leaned forward. "With all due respect," Mark said, "we are running a business, not a charity. We have a responsibility to maintain the Fair Taste brand. If we let just anyone walk in off the street, we risk losing our core clientele." Richard turned his gaze toward him. "And by anyone, you mean people who don't meet your personal definition of what a paying customer looks like?" Mark straightened. "I mean people who disrupt the atmosphere. People who drive away the customers that keep this business profitable." Richard let out a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "Let me ask you something, Mark. What's the purpose of a business?" Mark hesitated, then responded, "To make money." Richard nodded. "To make money. Exactly. He picked up another report and held it up. Now, let me show you something. He pulled up data from the locations that hadn't engaged in discriminatory practices. Their numbers were steady, some even outperforming the ones that had turned customers away. You see, the problem with your logic, Richard said, is that the stores treating all customers with respect are just as profitable, if not more, than the ones enforcing this so-called brand protection. Mark opened his mouth, but Richard cut him off. And do you know why? He continued. Because loyalty matters. A customer who is treated with dignity today comes back tomorrow. They bring their family, they spread the word, and they respect the business that respects them. Mark scoffed. That's idealistic, not realistic. Richard leaned forward slightly. What's not realistic is thinking you can build a company by deciding which paying customers are good enough for you. The tension in the room thickened. Some managers shifted in their seats. A few nodded subtly, seeing the truth in Richard's words. Then Richard delivered his final blow. I'm giving every manager in this room a choice. He said, if you believe that fair taste should only serve a certain type of customer, then you're in the wrong business. Either we change, or you can leave. Silence. Mark's jaw tightened, his fingers tapping against the table. He wasn't used to losing ground. Richard scanned the room one last time. You have 24 hours to decide. Mark sat in his office long after the meeting had ended, his fingers drumming against the edge of his desk. Richard had backed him into a corner, forcing a public confrontation that left him looking like a relic of outdated policies. But Mark wasn't the kind of man to sit back and wait for his downfall. If Richard wanted a battle, he was going to get one. Instead of complying with the changes, Mark started making calls. He reached out to managers he knew shared his concerns, people who had spent years running their locations under the unspoken rule that fair taste wasn't just about food, but about maintaining an image. They gathered that evening in a quiet, upscale bar on the Upper East Side, a place far removed from the customers Richard seemed so determined to accommodate. Mark leaned in, lowering his voice as he spoke. Richard is playing a dangerous game. He thinks he can rewrite the rules overnight. But we're the ones who actually run these restaurants. If he wants to throw away everything we built, we don't have to sit back and let it happen. A younger manager, Steve, swirled the whiskey in his glass. So, what are we supposed to do? Quit? Mark smirked. No, we make him quit. He laid out his plan. They would turn Richard's own decisions against him, making it seem like his new policies were sinking the company. They would quietly manipulate sales figures, making it appear as though customer dissatisfaction was driving revenue down. They would push key investors to question whether fair taste was losing its exclusivity and, more importantly, its profitability. And when the board sees the numbers, Mark concluded, they'll have no choice but to step in. The managers exchanged looks, some hesitant, others intrigued. Then, one by one, they nodded. The sabotage began immediately. Employees at certain locations were instructed to subtly discourage high-spending regulars from returning. Special treatment that once kept VIP guests loyal was quietly withdrawn. Some managers delayed service on purpose, ensuring that Richard's newly embraced customers, the ones he was so eager to defend, left with a less than ideal experience. And the numbers reflected it. Meanwhile, James, in his new role as quality control supervisor, started to notice inconsistencies. He had been keeping a close eye on employee behavior, checking in on stores unannounced. At first, things seemed normal, but then, he began noticing small patterns. A server would politely steer a customer toward takeout instead of seating them. A hostess would claim there were no available tables when several sat empty. The refusals weren't blatant, but they were happening just enough to be concerning. One afternoon, James sat across from Richard in his office, relaying what he had seen. I don't have hard proof, he admitted, but it's happening. Some of these people still don't want change, and they're finding ways to make sure it doesn't stick. Richard leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. And you think Mark's behind this? James exhaled. I'd bet my pension on it. Richard nodded slowly, but without concrete evidence. He knew confronting Mark outright would backfire. He needed more. Across town, Mark was making his next move. He had been quietly reaching out to investors, planting doubts about Richard's leadership. If he could get the boardroom to turn against him, Then it wouldn't matter what Richard wanted. His time at Fair Taste would come to an end. Richard sat at his desk, his eyes scanning the financial reports that had just landed in his inbox. At first glance, the numbers appeared to confirm what Mark and his allies had been saying. Several Fair Taste locations had seen a significant drop in revenue since the new policies were put in place. But something about the data felt off. He pulled up older reports from the same locations and began comparing them side by side. The discrepancies were subtle but undeniable. The drop in reported revenue didn't align with actual customer traffic. If fewer customers had been coming in, that would be one thing. But foot traffic logs showed no real decline. People were still dining at Fair Taste. Yet somehow, sales numbers were shrinking. Richard leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. This wasn't just natural market fluctuation. Someone was manipulating the numbers. By midday, he had ordered a full internal audit. Every transaction from the past 2 months would be reviewed. Any inconsistencies would be flagged. He also discreetly reached out to his finance team, asking them to monitor all financial interactions between restaurant managers and external vendors. If someone was shifting money around, Richard wanted to know about it. Meanwhile, James had been doing his own digging. His time in the military had trained him to recognize patterns, and something about the way certain employees handled reports had caught his attention. One afternoon, while reviewing the sales logs for his assigned location, he noticed something strange. There were 2 separate sets of records. One set was the official data sent to headquarters. The other was an internal log that had been edited before being submitted. Prices on certain menu items had been adjusted downward, making it look as if revenue was lower than it actually was. Cash payments were underreported. Discounts that hadn't been approved were added retroactively. Someone was deliberately skewing the numbers. James didn't waste time. He printed out copies of the discrepancies, highlighting the alterations, and took them straight to Richard's office. Richard flipped through the pages, his jaw tightening as he reached the last few entries. "These changes," Richard said, tapping the paper, "they were made after closing hours. Who has access to the system after hours?" James crossed his arms. "Managers and a few senior employees." Richard nodded slowly. "And the changes all trace back to Mark's group." James didn't need to say anything. They both knew exactly what was happening. Richard exhaled, setting the documents down. He couldn't go after Mark without airtight proof. But this was a start. He needed more leverage. Over the next few days, Richard took a calculated approach. Instead of confronting Mark directly, he began having quiet conversations with key investors, people who weren't necessarily loyal to him, but who had enough of a stake in Fair Taste that they would care if the company was being sabotaged from within. He framed the situation carefully. He didn't accuse anyone outright but instead posed a simple question. If Fair Taste's numbers were truly declining, wouldn't it make sense to investigate why? If there was internal mismanagement, wouldn't it be in everyone's best interest to uncover it? At the same time, Richard started making discreet inquiries with his contacts in the media. If things escalated, he wanted to be ready. Mark, however, wasn't blind to what was happening. He had expected Richard to push back. But now he sensed something more dangerous. Richard wasn't just reacting, he was planning. And that meant Mark needed to act first. Mark paced inside the boardroom, his fingers tapping against the polished oak table as the most influential shareholders of Fair Taste settled into their seats. The tension in the room was thick, a quiet hum of hushed conversations filling the air. Some investors had already heard whispers of financial struggles, and Mark was about to capitalize on their fears. He stood at the front of the room, clearing his throat before addressing them. "We have a problem," he began, his voice even, calculated, a serious one. He clicked a remote, and a projector screen behind him lit up with financial charts. The numbers, carefully manipulated, showed a steady decline in revenue since Richard's new policies had gone into effect. In just a few months, Mark continued, gesturing toward the figures. "We've seen customer retention drop by nearly 15%. High-spending regulars are taking their business elsewhere. And why? Because we're no longer catering to them. We've sacrificed the brand identity that made Fair Taste successful in the first place." A murmur rippled through the room. Several investors exchanged glances, some nodding in quiet agreement. "This is not about morality," Mark pressed on. This is about business, about profit. And right now, Richard Cole's decisions are driving this company in the wrong direction. An older man near the center of the table, one of the company's longest-standing investors, folded his hands together. What are you suggesting? Mark exhaled, giving a measured pause. I'm suggesting we reconsider the leadership strategy before this company loses its footing permanently. We need to protect our market, our customers, and our future. The room was silent for a moment. Then, a few heads began to nod. Just as Mark felt the momentum swinging in his favor, the door opened. Richard entered, holding a folder in one hand, his expression calm but firm. He didn't look flustered or angry, if anything. He seemed prepared. Hope I'm not interrupting, Richard said, his tone polite but carrying an unmistakable authority. Mark tensed but forced a smile. Richard, we were just discussing. Richard raised a hand. I know exactly what you were discussing. He walked toward the front of the room, setting his folder on the table. And before anyone makes any decisions, I think it's important that everyone here sees the full picture. He opened the folder, revealing printed financial reports. Unlike Mark's carefully curated data, these reports came from an independent audit. I had a feeling something wasn't adding up, Richard continued. So, I ordered a third-party review of our revenue trends. He turned to the investors. What Mark failed to mention is that while some locations have shown a decrease in reported revenue, customer traffic has remained stable. That's because the numbers have been manipulated. A low murmur spread across the room. Richard clicked the remote in his own hand, and a new slide replaced Mark's. This one displayed a breakdown of altered sales reports, showing where and how certain locations had been underreporting revenue. The reality is that these losses were fabricated. Some managers, under Mark's direction, have been adjusting figures to make it seem as though our new policies are failing. Mark let out a forced chuckle. Richard, that's a serious accusation. Mistakes happen in data reporting all the time. You can't. Richard turned another page in his folder and held it up. I might agree with you, he said, if I hadn't found this. It was an email, one sent from Mark's personal account to a select group of managers. James had been the one to find it, buried deep in the company's system. A direct instruction from Mark telling managers to adjust the numbers accordingly, to create a clear picture of failure. Richard handed the printed copy to the closest investor, who scanned it before passing it down the table. The energy in the room shifted. One by one, the shareholders turned their eyes to Mark. Some looked shocked, others calculating. Mark's jaw tightened. For the first time, he looked genuinely uncertain. But even as the weight of the evidence pressed against him, he wasn't ready to surrender. Richard could see it in his eyes. Mark still had one last move left to play. Mark adjusted his tie, forcing a smirk as he looked around the boardroom. The walls were closing in. But he wasn't finished yet. He could feel the shift in the air. Richard had the upper hand. The evidence was stacking against him, and the board was starting to see him for what he was. But he had been in tight spots before, and he always had a way out. Clearing his throat, Mark stood. I hate to be the one to bring this up, he began, his voice calm and measured. But before we all start congratulating Richard on his moral high ground, perhaps we should take a closer look at his real motivations. A few skeptical glances turned in his direction. Mark reached into his briefcase, pulling out a thick folder. He slid it across the table, the papers fanning out just enough to reveal the heading, Veterans United Foundation, Financial Contributions and Beneficiary Records. Richard's eyes narrowed. Mark continued. Richard would have you believe that his decision to hire James Miller was purely an act of goodwill. But what if I told you that Richard has a personal financial interest in a nonprofit that benefits from these very policies? The room went still. Mark flipped open the file and pointed to a highlighted section. Richard has an undisclosed stake in a foundation that provides employment opportunities for veterans. And guess what? The more veterans placed in companies like Fair Taste, the more funding the foundation receives. A murmur spread through the room. Some board members leaned in, skimming the documents, while others turned toward Richard with questioning eyes. Now, Mark said, spreading his hands, I'm not saying Richard doesn't care about helping people, but it seems a little too convenient, doesn't it? Hiring James wasn't just about changing Fairtaste's policies, it was about securing grants and boosting his public image. Richard clenched his jaw, realizing exactly what Mark was doing. The document was real, partially. He did support the Veterans United Foundation. He had donated to it for years. But he had no financial stake in its success. And Fair Taste had never benefited financially from any connection to the nonprofit. But to an outsider, the optics were damaging. One of the older board members adjusted his glasses. Richard, is this true? Do you have financial ties to this organization? Richard exhaled, steadying himself. Yes, I've supported the foundation for years. Just as I've supported other causes that align with my values. But Fair Taste has never received a cent from Veterans United. There's no conflict of interest here. Mark smirked. That's what you say. But public perception is another matter. Isn't it? The media's already picked up on this. He pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. Within seconds, news headlines flashed onto the projector screen behind him. Fair Taste CEO accused of using veterans for PR stunt. New scandal. Richard Cole's business ties to nonprofit under scrutiny. Richard's stomach tightened. He knew how this game was played. Facts didn't matter, perception did. Several board members exchanged uneasy glances. James, who had been silent until now, pushed his chair back and stood. I've had enough of this, he said, his voice clear and unwavering. The room quieted. James walked to the center of the table, placing both hands on the polished surface. His gaze swept across the room, landing on each board member before settling on Mark. You want to talk about perception? He said. Let's talk about reality. James straightened his shoulders. A few months ago, I was sleeping in a shelter. Not because I was lazy. Not because I didn't want to work. But because I was discarded. No one gave me a chance. He turned to Mark. People like you made sure of that. Mark scoffed. James, this isn't personal. James cut him off. The hell it isn't. He turned back to the board. Richard Cole didn't give me charity. He gave me dignity, a job, a purpose. He let that sink in. And not just me. The employees at Fair Taste who have been mistreated. The customers who have been turned away. This isn't about money. It's about the kind of company you all want to run. Then Richard took his turn. He lifted a separate stack of papers. I had a feeling Mark might try something like this, he said, flipping through the pages. So I did a little digging of my own. He looked up. Mark, would you care to explain why there are multiple unreported financial transactions between you and a handful of Fair Taste vendors? Mark's smirk faltered. Richard slid the papers down the table. Kickbacks, bribes, money funneled through third-party suppliers in exchange for preferential contracts. You've been stealing from this company for years. Mark swallowed. I've got emails, transaction records, even witness statements. Richard's voice remained steady. And let me be very clear, this isn't a public relations issue. It's fraud. A board member cleared his throat. Are you suggesting legal action? Richard nodded. Yes, and I'm also suggesting we put Mark's future with Fair Taste to a vote. The tension in the room reached its breaking point. Mark looked around, searching for allies, but the faces that had once supported him now looked away. The board members began murmuring among themselves, some already nodding in agreement. Mark had played his last card, and he had lost. Mark straightened his tie, suppressing the nervous energy creeping up his spine. He had come too far to let it all fall apart now. The boardroom was still heavy with tension from Richard's accusations. But Mark wasn't out of the fight yet. He glanced around the table, his mind working fast. He had one last move to play. And if he executed it right, Richard wouldn't be the one standing at the end of this meeting, he would. Clearing his throat, Mark spoke. I didn't want to bring this up, he said, feigning reluctance. But I've been in discussions with several of our major shareholders. Many of them share my concerns. He let the statement hang in the air before delivering the blow. As of this morning, he continued, I have secured enough support to call for a no-confidence vote against Richard Cole as CEO of Fair Taste. A murmur spread across the room. Some board members shifted uncomfortably, while others exchanged knowing glances. Mark pressed forward. This company is at a crossroads, he said. Either we remain a respected, profitable brand, or we become a misguided charity project, hemorrhaging revenue for the sake of optics. Richard wants you to believe that he's saving Fair Taste. But what he's really doing is dismantling everything we built. His words landed. A few board members nodded, considering his argument. Others remained stone-faced. Mark smirked inwardly. He had them. The board has the authority to make a decision today. He continued. A vote of no confidence would allow us to install new leadership, someone who understands the core mission of fair taste. Someone who prioritizes business over personal ideology. He leaned back in his chair. I move that we take a vote. Richard, who had remained silent throughout Mark's speech, finally sat forward, clasping his hands together. He looked at the room, not with panic or anger, but with quiet certainty. You're right about one thing, Mark, Richard said. This company is at a crossroads. But the choice in front of us isn't about profit versus charity. It's about who we are and what we stand for. Mark scoffed. Spare us the speech, Richard. The numbers speak for themselves. Richard ignored him and turned to the board. I'm not asking you to choose between making money and doing the right thing. That's a false choice. The best businesses are the ones that create something lasting, not just for shareholders, but for employees, customers, and the communities they serve. He gestured toward the employees in the room. Ask them what fair taste stands for. James pushed his chair back and stood. I've sat here and listened to Mark talk about what's best for this company, James said, but let's be clear, he's not worried about Fairtast's future. He's worried about losing control. Mark rolled his eyes. Oh, please. James cut him off. You call this a business decision. But what you've really done is manipulate data, threaten people's jobs, and lie to this board to get what you want. He turned to the board members. I know what it's like to be discarded. To be told you're too old, too broken, not worth the effort. He paused, his voice steady. That's what Mark represents. Then James looked at Richard. And this man? He represents a future where people like me get a second chance. Then, Maria Lopez stood. I work in one of the restaurants Mark oversees, she said, her voice firm. I've seen how his leadership works. I've seen how employees were pressured to turn customers away, how numbers were changed, how the people at the top benefited while the people at the bottom were told to keep quiet. She met Mark's gaze. I won't keep quiet anymore. The weight in the room shifted. The doubt Mark had planted was unraveling. Richard let the moment settle before speaking again. You all have a choice, he said simply. But let me be clear, if we let this kind of leadership continue, Fair Taste will not survive. Not because of financial losses, but because no company can succeed when it sells out its integrity. He leaned back. Now, let's vote. The air was thick with tension as the board prepared to cast their ballots. Mark sat still, his fingers curling into a fist beneath the table. He had counted the votes before coming in today. He had been certain he had the numbers. But now, as the board members scribbled their decisions onto slips of paper, doubt crept into his mind. Had he miscalculated? The room was silent except for the sound of paper sliding against paper as the votes were counted. Each slip was placed into two separate stacks, one for Richard, one for Mark. The tension was suffocating, the kind that made even the most seasoned board members shift uncomfortably in their seats. Mark sat rigid, his hands clasped tightly together, his knuckles white from the pressure. He had gone into this vote believing he had the numbers. He had spoken to the right people, made the right promises. Yet as the count progressed, something was shifting. At first, he was ahead, a small but comfortable lead. He allowed himself to breathe. Then, Richard's numbers started climbing. A few neutral board members who Mark had assumed would stay out of it began siding with Richard. The lead tightened, whispers filled the room, and then, it came down to one final vote. All eyes turned to Howard Ellis, one of the company's largest stakeholders, an older man with a sharp mind and a reputation for being methodical. Howard had remained silent through most of the meeting, watching, absorbing. He held the deciding ballot in his hand. He exhaled slowly and set it down. Richard Cole, 11. Mark Reynolds, 10. It was over. Mark's face remained impassive, but his fingers curled into fists beneath the table. He had lost. Richard sat still for a moment, letting the weight of the victory settle in before speaking. His voice was calm but firm. The board has spoken. I will remain as CEO of Fair Taste. The decision sent a ripple through the room. Some board members nodded approvingly, while others exchanged unreadable glances. But Mark barely noticed. The blood was pounding in his ears. Then, the second vote was called. The matter of Mark Reynolds' position at Fair Taste is now up for vote. Howard announced, effective immediately, the board will decide whether Mr. Reynolds will retain his position within the company. Mark's stomach twisted. He had been so focused on taking Richard down that he hadn't fully prepared for the possibility of losing his own seat. This time, the vote was swift. Mark Reynolds. 3. Termination. 18. He felt the room tilt slightly as reality sank in. The vote wasn't even close. Richard looked at him now, his expression unreadable. There was no gloating, no smirk of triumph, just quiet resolution. Effective immediately, Richard said. Mark Reynolds is relieved of all duties at Fair Taste. Security will escort him out of the building. Mark pushed back his chair abruptly. Standing with stiff movements, he forced a smirk, though it barely held. I built half of this company, he muttered. Let's see how well you run it without me. Richard didn't rise to the bait. 2 security officers appeared by the door, waiting for Mark to leave. For a moment, he hesitated, as if expecting someone to object, to stand up for him, to say this was all a mistake. No one did. With a final glance at Richard, Mark turned and strode toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the silent room. He didn't look back. Outside the boardroom, as he was led through the hallways of the company he had once ruled with confidence, his expression darkened. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. Meanwhile, back inside, Richard exhaled, allowing himself a moment to take it all in. The fight was over, but the real work was just beginning. He stood and faced the board. We need to move forward. Starting today, Fair Taste will no longer tolerate discrimination at any level. That means new policies, new oversight, and accountability. Some members looked uneasy, but most nodded. Richard continued, we'll also be expanding employment opportunities, not just for veterans, but for anyone looking for a fair chance. That includes training programs and mentorship initiatives to make sure our company represents what it truly stands for. A murmur of approval spread through the room. And then, finally, Richard turned to James. I'd like to formally offer you the position of Director of Customer Experience and Ethics. Your job will be to make sure that what happened before never happens again. James blinked, caught off guard. He had fought for this, believed in it, but he hadn't expected this level of trust. After a pause, he nodded. I won't let you down. Richard smiled. I know you won't. As the meeting adjourned, Richard took one final look at the boardroom, the room where power had shifted, where battles had been won and lost. And somewhere, out there, Mark Reynolds was walking away. But Richard knew men like him never truly disappeared. Richard sat at his desk, staring at the news articles spread across his screen. The headlines were everywhere. Fair Taste in crisis. Internal power struggle exposes deep divisions. CEO Richard Cole survives coup. But can he save the brand? Fair Taste's future. New policies or business suicide? Despite the victory over Mark, the battle was far from over. The company's reputation had taken a hit, and customers were uneasy. Some loyal patrons praised the leadership shake-up, but others questioned whether Fair Taste was heading in the wrong direction. Investors, always wary of instability, were watching closely. Richard leaned back, rubbing his temples. He had anticipated resistance, but he hadn't expected the backlash to be this intense. Change was never easy, but if Fair Taste was to truly become a company that valued both profit and people, he had to act fast. The first step, taking control of the narrative. He arranged a press conference for the following afternoon, knowing this was his chance to reset the conversation. When he stepped onto the stage, the room was packed with reporters, cameras flashing as he took his place behind the podium. He cleared his throat and spoke with measured confidence. Fair Taste is more than just a business. It's a reflection of the values we choose to uphold. And let me be clear, we will not stand for discrimination, whether it's toward our employees or our customers. He paused, scanning the crowd. The events of the past few weeks have been difficult, but they've also given us the opportunity to do better. That's why today, I'm announcing a new initiative, the Second Chance Program. A murmur spread through the audience. This program is designed to provide employment opportunities for those who have been overlooked, veterans, the homeless, and individuals who have faced unjust barriers in the job market. Because everyone deserves a chance to rebuild. The response was mixed. Some reporters scribbled furiously, while others remained skeptical. A journalist raised a hand. Some critics say this is just a PR stunt to fix Fairtast's image. What do you say to them? Richard didn't hesitate. I say actions speak louder than words. Give us time, and you'll see for yourself. The turning point came when James's story began to circulate. A former soldier, once turned away from a fair taste restaurant, now leading the company's efforts to ensure fairness and respect. His journey resonated with people in ways corporate statements never could. Online discussions shifted. Customers started sharing their own stories. One longtime patron recounted witnessing discrimination at a fair taste location months ago but now felt hopeful about the company's changes. But not everyone was on board. Within the restaurants, James faced resistance. Some employees resented the changes, believing they were unnecessary disruptions. Others whispered behind his back, questioning his qualifications. James expected this. He had spent his life overcoming obstacles, and this was no different. Instead of demanding respect, he earned it, one conversation at a time. He made the rounds at every location, sitting down with employees, asking about their concerns, listening rather than preaching. Slowly, the hostility softened, not completely, but enough. Then, just as things seemed to be settling, an email arrived in Richard's inbox. The subject line was simple. You think this is over? The message was brief. You may have won this round, but don't fool yourself. This isn't the end. Richard read the words twice, his grip tightening on the mouse. Whoever had sent it hadn't signed their name. Mark was gone, but clearly, someone else wasn't finished. Richard stared at the email on his screen, reading the words over again. You may have won this round, but don't fool yourself. This isn't the end. The message had arrived late the night before, sent from an anonymous address. He had immediately forwarded it to the IT department, hoping to trace the source. But by the next morning, the response was the same, untraceable. Richard wasn't surprised. Whoever had sent it knew what they were doing. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. Mark was gone, but that didn't mean his influence had vanished. There were still people within Fair Taste who had supported him, some openly, others more quietly, and Richard had no doubt that some of them weren't happy about how things had turned out. At the last board meeting, a few members had kept their distance, their expressions carefully neutral. Others had been outright cold. It was subtle, but Richard knew the signs. Resentment still lingered in the air. Just as he was about to push the email aside, his phone buzzed. His assistant's voice came through the speaker. You should check social media, she said, a note of urgency in her tone. It's blowing up. Richard pulled up the trending topics, his stomach tightening as he read the headlines. Fair Taste faces backlash as high-profile customers speak out. Elliot Mason, CEO of Mason & Company, denounces Fairtast's lack of standards in guest selection. Luxury dining or charity? Fairtast's new policies raise eyebrows. He clicked on Elliot Mason's post. I've always supported Fair Taste, but I can't continue to do so under these new policies. A business needs to maintain its standards. If we remove all expectations, what are we left with? The comment section was a battlefield. Some praised Elliot for standing up for what they saw as exclusive dining experiences. Others slammed him for being elitist. Richard exhaled slowly. He knew this would happen eventually. The moment he changed Fairtast's policies, there would be pushback from the more affluent clientele, people who valued exclusivity over ethics. Within hours, several other high-profile customers echoed Elliot's concerns, threatening to take their business elsewhere. And, of course, the media seized the opportunity. Has Fair Taste gone too far? The risks of prioritizing morality over business. Richard Cole's new policies could cost him more than he bargained for. That was all the board needed to see. By noon, his inbox was filled with emails from worried investors and executives. A few board members had already reached out, requesting an emergency meeting to discuss the sustainability of the company's direction. Richard paced his office, weighing his options. He had two choices. 1. He could adjust the policies, reassure the VIP customers that Fair Taste would still cater to their expectations, and try to strike a balance between exclusivity and inclusivity. It would quiet the backlash. At least temporarily. Or two. He could hold firm, knowing that doing the right thing often came with a cost. James walked into the office, holding a printout of the latest headlines. You're not actually considering backing down, are you? Richard didn't answer right away. It's not that simple. It is, James said. You knew this was coming. We all did. Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. And what if we lose a significant chunk of our high-end customers? What if it starts affecting jobs? James folded his arms. You think the employees who believe in this company would rather serve overpriced meals to snobs like Elliot Mason than work for a business that actually respects people? You're giving them too much credit. Richard looked at him. And what about the board? The investors? They're already panicking. James shrugged. Then let them. They'll either come around, or they'll leave. But you already made your choice when you fired Mark. Richard nodded slowly, the weight of the decision settling in his chest. Before he could respond, there was a knock at the door. His assistant poked her head in, her face unusually tense. Richard, someone's here to see you. Who? She hesitated. Mark Reynolds. Richard froze. James stiffened beside him. You've got to be kidding me. She shook her head. He says he just wants to talk. Richard exhaled sharply, straightening his posture. Send him in. The door swung open, and there he was, Mark Reynolds. He stepped inside, his expression unreadable, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. Richard met his gaze, his jaw tightening. Mark smirked. Miss me? Mark stepped into Richard's office with the air of a man who had nothing to lose but everything to gain. His posture was relaxed, almost too comfortable for someone who had been publicly humiliated and ousted from the company not long ago. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, his smirk barely concealed. Richard remained seated behind his desk, his expression unreadable. He had expected Mark to resurface eventually, but he hadn't anticipated it would be this soon. More importantly, he hadn't expected him to walk in as if he were still in control. You've got some nerve showing up here, Richard said, folding his hands together. Mark chuckled, glancing around the office. Come on, Richard. We both knew this wasn't the end. I figured I'd save you the trouble of waiting for my next move. Richard didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he leaned back, studying the man before him. Let's cut to the chase. Why are you here? Mark's smirk widened as he took a seat across from Richard, crossing one leg over the other. I'm here to offer you a deal. Richard arched an eyebrow. A deal? You mean blackmail? Mark laughed, shaking his head. Oh, no, nothing so crude. Call it a business opportunity. Richard didn't respond, waiting for him to continue. Mark leaned forward slightly. I've joined Sterling Dine Group. Richard's jaw tightened, but he gave no other reaction. Sterling Dine was one of Fairtast's biggest competitors, a high-end restaurant group that had built its reputation on exclusivity and luxury. If Mark had aligned himself with them, it meant trouble. They see what's happening here, Richard. Mark continued. They see the chaos, the backlash, the customers walking away, and they're ready to step in. In fact, we've already started laying the groundwork for a full-scale takeover of your market share. Richard's fingers tapped lightly against the desk. He wasn't surprised. Mark had always been calculated. Mark's voice dropped slightly, as if he were revealing a secret. But here's the thing. I convinced them that this doesn't have to be a war. There's a way we both win. Richard exhaled, shaking his head. I don't negotiate with people who tried to sabotage my company. Mark ignored the remark. Sterling Dine is prepared to back off. No aggressive expansion. No direct attacks on Fairtast's brand. In exchange, all you have to do is reconsider some of your more controversial policies. Richard stiffened. He knew exactly what Mark was referring to. The Second Chance program. Mark nodded. Let's be honest, Richard. The whole thing is a PR nightmare. It's driving away high-end clientele, making your investors nervous, and, let's face it, it's a losing battle. You don't need to scrap it completely. Just scale it back. Quietly, Richard stared at him, incredulous. So, let me get this straight. You want me to abandon the very thing that sets Fair Taste apart? The thing that actually makes a difference? Mark shrugged. I want you to make a smart business decision. Right now, Fair Taste is bleeding, and once Sterling Dine launches its campaign, You won't just lose a few VIP customers. You'll lose your standing as an elite brand. That's the reality. For a moment, silence hung between them. Richard studied Mark's face, searching for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of doubt, but there was none. Mark believed every word he was saying. And that was exactly why Richard knew he could never take this deal. He stood up slowly, placing both hands on his desk. Fair Taste was never just about luxury, Mark, and it never will be. Mark exhaled dramatically. Right, because you're a man of principles. Richard met his gaze. If we have to lose some customers to stay true to who we are, then so be it. Mark clicked his tongue, shaking his head. I was afraid you'd say that. He stood, straightening his suit jacket. Well, I tried. Just remember, when Sterling Dine launches its campaign, you had a chance to stop it. Richard didn't flinch. We'll handle it. Mark smirked. Let's see how long that confidence lasts. As he turned to leave, he paused at the door. Oh, and Richard? This time, I'm not coming for your job. I'm coming for your company. Richard clenched his jaw but said nothing. The door shut behind Mark, and the office fell into silence. Richard sat down, inhaling deeply. He had won the battle before. But this was something else. This wasn't just about internal corruption anymore. This was about survival in a cutthroat industry. Mark wasn't bluffing. Sterling Dine was powerful, and if they had Mark leading their attack, Fair Taste was in for the fight of its life. Richard refused to play defense. Instead of waiting for Sterling Dine's campaign to unfold, he took the first strike. If they wanted a battle for public perception, he would ensure Fair Taste wasn't just reacting but shaping the conversation. He reached out to multiple nonprofit organizations, ones that supported veterans, job training programs, and initiatives for the homeless. Together, they launched a public awareness campaign explaining why the Second Chance program mattered. Not just for Fair Taste, but for the industry as a whole. Then, he took it a step further. He arranged for a primetime interview on the Business Hour, one of the most influential talk shows in the country. Sitting across from the seasoned host, Richard maintained his calm, professional demeanor as he addressed the controversy head-on. Fair Taste isn't abandoning luxury dining, he explained. We're redefining what luxury means. It's not just about exclusivity, it's about experience, about integrity, about knowing that the meal you're enjoying comes from a business that values every human being who walks through its doors. The host leaned in, pressing, but your critics argue that this policy is hurting your brand. Some of your longtime VIP clients have taken their business elsewhere. Richard nodded. Yes, and that was expected. But here's the thing. We're gaining new customers. People who share our values. People who care about more than just a name on a menu. The interview went viral. And then, something unexpected happened. James's story started spreading across social media. A former soldier who had served his country, then lost everything, now given a second chance, not out of charity, but because he had something valuable to offer. People resonated with it, even some of Fairtaste's former VIP customers, who had initially walked away, began reconsidering. Some admitted they had been too quick to judge, that they had let the media shape their views without seeing the full picture. Others posted about how they had personally witnessed unfair treatment of lower-income customers at high-end establishments and were glad to see someone taking a stand against it. Sterling Dine's smear campaign backfired. Instead of tarnishing Fairtaste's image, they had unwittingly fueled the conversation around corporate responsibility. The turning point came when a prominent business ethics professor wrote an op-ed titled, "Fairtaste's Gamble Might Just Change the Industry for the Better." As the tide shifted, Sterling Dine's own reputation began to suffer. Their aggressive tactics were exposed. And suddenly, they weren't seen as the sophisticated alternative, they were the corporate bully trying to squash innovation. And Mark? He watched as his plan unraveled. Sterling Dine, once so eager to use him as their weapon, quickly distanced themselves. They couldn't afford the bad press. Within weeks, Mark found himself edged out of the company. His name no longer held power. His influence evaporated. He disappeared from the public eye. But Richard knew men like Mark never truly disappeared. They waited. They watched. They found new angles to exploit. For now, though, Fair Taste had won. In the weeks that followed, Richard solidified the company's new direction. The Second Chance program was expanded, with partnerships forming in cities across the country. Fair Taste became more than a restaurant chain, it became a movement. James thrived in his new role, proving that one person, given the right opportunity, could make an immeasurable difference. And within Fairtast's own walls, something had shifted. The employees, even those who had been skeptical, started to see the value in what they were building. The culture changed, not overnight, but steadily, undeniably. One evening, Richard sat alone in his office, looking out over the city skyline. The battle was won, but the fight, for fairness, for integrity, for truth, never truly ended. He exhaled, a small smile forming. Good. That meant there was still work to be done. At the heart of this story is a simple but powerful truth: everyone deserves a second chance. Richard stood his ground, not just for one man, but for an entire system that had forgotten its humanity. And in the end, doing the right thing didn't just save a business, it reshaped an entire industry. But here's the real question: if you were in Richard's shoes, would you have done the same? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe in uncovering the truth, exposing injustice, and fighting for what's right, hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more eye-opening stories. This is Undercover Truths, where the truth always comes to light.